Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and partaking in our celebration. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. There we go. Okay. Sorry. All right, thank you also to those of you joining us online. It's a pleasure to have you with us as well, and to have this opportunity to share our meeting with those who aren't able to be here in person. All of us here tonight, whether you're an LWF member, a supporter, whether you're a staff person, a volunteer, a board member, or science advisor, it's because of our collective efforts, because of the work we do together, that we are seeing successes. And so excited to celebrate the success with sewage treatment this year with you, because it really would not have been possible without our collective voice together. So thank you. You've proven that we can make change when we work together. This past year has been an incredibly busy one for LWF, and I'm excited to share some of our successes with you. You can also read about them in our new annual report for 2023. We've redesigned our report. We're speaking to our 4 strategic objectives in our new strategic plan, and our new report really emphasizes the focus we want to put on measuring and communicating our impact. So being honest and transparent about our successes, but also the challenges and the risks that we face as an organization as we pursue our mission. Now, many of you know my heart lies in our advocacy work. So that is what I'd like to speak with you about tonight. I want to talk about our successes. I want to talk about the opportunities on the horizon in the coming months for us to continue to make change for Lake Winnipeg. So I'm going to talk about 3 advocacy issues that we are active on, and these are all articulated in our new strategic plan. The first is achieving phosphorus compliance at Winnipeg's North End Water Pollution Control Centre. The second is providing robust and credible data to focus a new federal funding program in persistent phosphorus hotspots within the watershed. And the third is using our voice to uplift Indigenous rights and knowledge to ensure the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in public policy processes for Lake Winnipeg. So you guys know the punchline to this one. Cheers. But I'm going to take you through some of the steps, because I know this process of advocating for change at the North End treatment plant has been a frustrating one. It has been a long haul. There have been challenges. There have been upsets. And it's important to really step back and take in the big picture, because all those little challenges, all those little frustrations have led to a really big success. So, to accelerate phosphorus compliance at the North End treatment plant, we first proposed a chemical phosphorus reduction solution using the chemical ferric chloride. And this is based on a tried and true method that's used in wastewater treatment plants around the Great Lakes and has been used since the 1980s. And it was recognized as a cost-effective and a timely solution, something that could be put in place relatively quickly. We brought this forward in 2018, recognizing that the city was coming up to a compliance deadline for the North End treatment plant, and they were not going to succeed at meeting it in 2019. So we wanted to propose a new solution, a new approach that could get the city closer to phosphorus compliance more quickly. Essentially, this solution adjusts the timing and the dosage of the chemical ferric chloride at the treatment plant such that the chemical binds to phosphorus and pulls it into the wastewater sludge. Now, ferric chloride was already in use at the North End treatment plant. It was used to prevent clogging of the pipes, and it was used to reduce odor emanating from the plant. So what we've done is taking an existing solution at the plant and applied it in a new way such that it can also reduce the phosphorus load. So by increasing the ferric chloride dosing, by adjusting the dosing points, we were able to bring that solution to the table. And our first success in this long journey came in 2019, which ironically happened because the city didn't meet their deadline. So in 2019, this was the second extended deadline from the province to upgrade the North End treatment plant, and the city didn't meet it. Sorry. But in response to this lack of meeting the deadline, the province didn't simply extend the deadline. They declared the treatment plant non-compliant, and they required the city to implement the interim phosphorus reduction solution that we had been advocating for. So this was the first acknowledgement on the part of the province of Manitoba that there was a need to change course to address phosphorus pollution and its increasingly urgent impacts. And we were helpfully on hand with a ready-made solution to do that. City Council also took important steps to make this a reality. In 2022, they approved all the funding that was needed for the interim phosphorus solution, and they also refined the design that we had proposed to maximize it and make it even more effective at reducing phosphorus. In 2023, the city took a step further and they increased funding for biosolids facilities at the North End treatment plant. The increased capacity of biosolids will enable us to treat more of the sludge that contains the ferric chloride and the phosphorus, and thereby further maximize the solution. And then, now this year finally, according to a city report that I read probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago, so there could be a little slippage on the deadline, the interim phosphorus reduction solution will be up and running by May 17th, which is Friday. And it's just remarkable to think that we're in the same week when something like this is actually going to be achieved after all the hard work, after all the effort. So congratulations to you for making this possible. It's actually quite stunning to stand here thinking that together we did this, right? This was not on anyone's agenda until we spoke up together. So thank you for sticking with it, and thank you for making change for the lake. Raise your glasses again if you've still got I have a few photos of this solution at the North End treatment plant. So this set of photos is from a tour that I took of the treatment plant back in 2022, when this was still a little bit of a figment of LWF's imagination. People were wondering how we were actually going to pull this off. This is the ferric chloride rail delivery. Well, my font didn't work out. I had a cute little permanent marker font that didn't show up. So this is where the ferric chloride, that chemical, was delivered to the treatment plant by rail line to serve the existing purpose of preventing those pipes from clogging and reducing the odors. The cars would be unloaded within this building, and then the ferric chloride would be transferred into the treatment plant for use by the treatment plant operators. And this is the photo that the City of Winnipeg shared at our meeting about 3 weeks ago of the expanded facility. So they've doubled the size of the rail car building. They've added a new line. They're able to accept more ferric chloride. They're able to bring that into the plant in order to reduce the phosphorus loading. And two things kind of hit me when I saw this photo. The first was like, wow, that's bricks and mortar that wasn't there, that we made happen, and that's remarkable. There's a whole new structure, there's a rail line, there's a whole new system in place. We really did it. We did it by working together. And my second thought was, it doesn't really look all that different from what was there before. I mean, the trim's the same, it's like a mirror image. They even match the brickwork. Like, it looks exactly the same. This really isn't rocket science. This is a simple, straightforward solution that has always been possible, no matter how many politicians told us we were dreaming way too big. We just needed to push them to make it happen. And so the message that I take from this photo and that I want to leave with you is, don't ever let them tell you it's too complicated. Don't ever let them tell you it's not simple and straightforward. We couldn't possibly ever make it happen. Because we did make it happen, and it doesn't look that remarkably different from what was happening before. This is one more photo of the new system set up at the treatment plant. I just wanted to share this because these are the new tanks and the ferric chloride dosing system. And And I think what it illustrates is how adaptable this system is. So treatment plant operators will be able to adjust the dosing at various points. They'll be able to monitor the impacts of that, then go back and make changes again. So it is a really adaptable system. It's not like a set it in place and it only works one way. They've told us that they're bringing in wastewater treatment operators to take a look at what they're doing, to provide recommendations to improve it. And this is a scalable solution. We will be able to take what happens here with this interim phosphorus reduction solution and scale it up, ideally, eventually, to actually achieve phosphorus compliance at the treatment plant. Already, this system is performing better than the city projected it would, and these are numbers from before the infrastructure is up and running. The column in blue shows predictions from a model that the city ran in 2020. And the column in yellow shows what they're actually measuring at the treatment plant. And both of these stages, stage 1 and stage 2, are before the interim solution, the new infrastructure, is up and running. This is opportunities for them to tweak that dosing at the existing dosing points, to increase or adjust, and just make the system maximally perform with the infrastructure that they already have. And we're seeing almost a 1% drop from what the model, or sorry, a 1 milligram per liter drop from what the model predicted in 2020. So I'm optimistic that as they get this new infrastructure up and running later this week, it will continue to perform better than their models projected. And while we might not get to compliance, we're certainly going to get closer than anything that would have happened without this solution in place. So we're not done yet. We can definitely celebrate this and claim this victory, but we do have an ongoing challenge in that provincial regulators are still asking the city to implement biological nutrient removal at the North End treatment plant, even after 2 decades of no progress in getting this system up and going. So recently the city submitted a timeline and a plan for implementing biological nutrient removal, and they're projecting that it will take until 2032 to build that system. And that's an optimistic timeline because the city currently has no funding and no workable funding sources on the horizon to pay for this system. And this is the most expensive phase of treatment plant upgrades that have been proposed at the North End treatment plant. We don't have a very good estimate of the cost. We have an estimate from 2018, but we all know what's happened to costs since 2018. So projecting ahead, I wouldn't be surprised if the biological nutrient removal system actually costs $1.5 billion at this point and climbing. And the longer that we don't have funding in place for it, the more that cost will continue to increase. All the while, waiting until 2032, we have ongoing phosphorus non-compliance at the treatment plant. We have ongoing releases of excess phosphorus to Lake Winnipeg. So to me, this doesn't look like a feasible plan. We have no funding, rapidly climbing costs, and at least 8 years, if not longer, before we achieve compliance. So we need a different approach. And this is where we keep making change together. Currently, Manitoba's Environment Minister, Tracy Schmidt, is reviewing the city's timeline and their proposal for biological nutrient removal. And we need to let her know that we can't wait for that solution, that we need to achieve phosphorus compliance using a system that's already being built at the North End treatment plant, that already has funding support behind it, and that can be achieved much more quickly than biological nutrient removal. So we're asking you to reach out to Minister Schmidt. We have a template on our website that you can find at this URL at the bottom, and let her know that Lake Winnipeg matters to you and you would like her to accelerate phosphorus compliance at the North End treatment plant. She can do that by scaling up this chemical phosphorus reduction solution, scaling up the biosolids treatment capacity at the North End treatment plant, but she needs to amend the license so that the city knows that this is a real expectation. And she has the power to do that. We need to let her know that that's what we expect. So the fight continues. We still have more to do. You can ask a question, that's okay.
Okay, it's about ferric chloride. I'm not involved in this at all, so it rang a bell for me and I wanted to know where it was. And it was from when the city of Winnipeg was having trouble with its drinking water and it was discolored. And at the time, it's still on the website, it talks about ferric chloride was the problem because it created trouble with manganese, which caused the discoloration, and they switched to ferric sulfide or sulfate, I'm not sure. But in any case, I'm just wondering, like, for someone like me, who just remembers ferric chloride and goes and looks on the website, City of Winnipeg, and sees it, it looks like a bad thing, and they say on the website that they don't use it anymore, which is obviously out of date.
Yeah, and that is the water treatment side of things that has talked about that, which I know less about that infrastructure. But it certainly has been and it continues to be in use on the wastewater treatment side of things. So those are two different processes, and there should definitely be some more clarity about how those chemicals are used in both of those. Yeah. So yes, if you want to take up the charge again to make change for Lake Winnipeg, please visit our website, take a look at the template. It's quick and easy to send an email to Minister Schmidt. She is looking at that plan right now, and we are waiting for a decision from her department on what the next step is for the city. So this is a great time to get in touch with her and let her know what you think. Okay, my second advocacy priority tonight is about targeting federal funding to phosphorus hotspots where it will have the biggest impact to protect Lake Winnipeg. Last year at our AGM, we celebrated the success of Budget 2023, which renewed federal funding for Lake Winnipeg for a period of 10 years. And that was great news. That was something we'd been calling for since 2022. We sent thank you postcards to Minister Stephen Guilbeault, thanking him for the investment. And now we're determined to make sure that that investment has the greatest impact that it can possibly have to protect the lake. So together with our partners, we're working to generate the evidence that's necessary for the federal government to target their funding to effectively reduce phosphorus loading. We know that not all areas of the watershed contribute equivalent or equal amounts of phosphorus to the lake. Provincial and federal monitoring tells us that the biggest source of phosphorus to Lake Winnipeg are the Red and Assiniboine rivers. Those watersheds contribute approximately 70% of the annual load to the lake every year. So that is the area where we need to focus our efforts. But it's still a huge area, and it would be helpful to be able to narrow it down even further. This is where the Lake Winnipeg community-based monitoring network comes in. This is a citizen science network designed to pinpoint smaller phosphorus hotspots within those larger river basins. Together with our partners, we mobilize volunteers who are dispersed across the landscape so they can sample frequently at sampling sites that are located close to their home, close to their work or their school, or on their commute. This allows us to collect very responsive data at a much finer spatial and temporal scale than centralized monitoring programs are able to do. We're committed to maintaining the credibility of our data set over the long term so that our data can be trusted by policymakers, by land managers, and by concerned citizens. Our field and lab protocols are robust and replicable, with quality control and quality assurance methods used in field and the lab. And we're also committed to maintaining this monitoring network over the long term. We're currently in our 9th field season in 2024, and we have now 7 years of analyzed data under our belt from 2016 to 2022. This long-term nature of this program is really important to us because we want to ensure that we're tracking changes over time, recognizing that phosphorus loading is impacted by climate change and by ongoing land use changes. So I'm excited to share our data from 2020 to 2022 today. Our staff have been working incredibly hard over the last year to address the backlog of data caused by the pandemic. When the pandemic arrived in Manitoba, it not only impacted our field activities, it also prevented us from accessing lab space, so we weren't able to analyze our water samples. But now we've done that. We've analyzed samples from 2020, 2021, and 2022, and so I can share them with you tonight. So in 2020, COVID-19 hit Manitoba at about the same time as the spring melt, which is when our field season starts. We want to make sure that our volunteers and our staff and our partners are out in the field when the big spring freshet arrives so that we're capturing that flow event with our sampling activities. Thanks to our science advisors who were nimble and responsive, we adapted our protocols so that we could continue monitoring throughout COVID-19 without putting anyone at risk. But we did recognize the need to really scale back the monitoring network. So if you've seen previous data, you'll know that this 2020 coverage of the network is much smaller than what we did in 2019. But we were able to continue monitoring at priority sites that we identified in advance when a number of other monitoring programs had to shut down that year. So we focused on those priority sites, including ones that had been identified as persistent hotspots in previous years. And this map does have a hotspot in it, but it's very small and it's hard to see. Right in there, there's a little red dot, and those are drainage areas within the Seine River watershed that showed up as hotspots in 2020. We'd seen them previously in 2019, 2017, and 2016. So we were able to continue to track those phosphorus hotspots, even with our scaled back network. In 2021, we knew much more about how COVID spreads. We were able to return to our usual sampling protocols and still keep everyone safe, and we scaled the network back up to coverage more like what we had in 2019. 2021 was a drought year. So there was much less water on the landscape, much less water flowing through tributaries to Lake Winnipeg, and as a result, very little phosphorus loading occurred. Water is essentially the vehicle that carries phosphorus to the lake, so when we have low phosphorus flows, when we have low water flows, we have low phosphorus loading. Question in the back?
Yeah, I just want to know if I'm reading this right. So the light yellow is low loading, and the dark red is a high loading, is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. We changed our maps used to be green to red, but we changed them for accessibility for folks who are colorblind, which includes my son. So he's been our tester at making sure he can interpret these maps. So generally, overall, across the network, very low phosphorus loading in a drought year, and that was what we expected. But there is one very curious red spot on the map along the Winnipeg River flowing into Traverse Bay. And this hotspot, which I'm going to put in quotes, is curious for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's the only hotspot that showed up in a very dry year of low phosphorus loading, even from those recurring and persistent phosphorus hotspots in the Seine River. And secondly, this site is along the Winnipeg River, which traditionally hasn't been a significant loader of phosphorus to Lake Winnipeg. Phosphorus concentrations in the river are generally quite low, and provincial and federal monitoring has shown us that it's maybe, I think it's 15% compared to the 70% from the Red River. So we are treating this hotspot with extreme caution, and we're going to urge everyone who accesses our data for other purposes to treat it as such as well. We're investigating whether this hotspot is actually just an artifact of some variation in our sampling or analysis protocols. And we're working with our science advisors to figure this out, so we'll have more to say on this as we dig into it and run some additional analyses and tests. But here's what we know about this site so far that kind of sets it apart. Data from this site is collected at Manitoba Hydro's Pine Falls Generating Station. So it's actually collected within a hydroelectric dam infrastructure. And that is a very different setup than a typical LWCBMN sampling site. Hydroelectric dams, while not sources of phosphorus, they're not phosphorus producers, do have an impact on phosphorus dynamics within a waterway. In particular, dams can sequester phosphorus upstream of the dam, creating a higher phosphorus concentration upstream than what is ultimately flowing downstream to the lake. And so phosphorus concentration may vary greatly depending on where and when the sample is collected. So if samples are being collected from different locations within the dam, from upstream or downstream of the dam, that could have a significant effect on our results. Additionally, the Winnipeg River is a huge river, very high flow, which contributes 43% of the total water flow to Lake Winnipeg. And our monitoring protocols were designed specifically for smaller creeks and streams. We collect integrated samples down through the entire water column of those smaller creeks and streams, so we get a well-mixed sample when we analyze it. And those sample collection protocols, while tailor-made for smaller waterways, might not translate into collecting representative samples from much larger waterways. As well, the phosphorus concentrations that we're measuring along the Winnipeg River are very low. Generally, they're like an order of magnitude lower than what we measure in the Red River. And that means that it's really the flow, the immense flow on the Winnipeg River, that's driving any hotspot that shows up there. And we need to better understand how that flow interacts with dam infrastructure, because dam infrastructure can cause quite drastic and sudden changes in flow. And if we don't capture those changes in flow with an effective sampling schedule, we're missing a lot of what's happening at that site. And finally, our lab analysis, which we test regularly against other labs across the country. It performs consistently well at the concentrations that we measure for the Red River, but Winnipeg River concentrations are so low that we don't have the same opportunity to compare our analysis at those concentrations to other labs across the country. So we plan to undertake further tests to try to assess our analysis at those low concentrations. So all of this means that we have more work to do before we can confidently say whether there are actually phosphorus hotspots along the Winnipeg River. And while we work on figuring this out, we don't want to lose focus on the persistent phosphorus hotspots that we find in the Red River. Okay.
Is this scale loading or loading per hectare?
This scale is export, so kilograms per hectare per year.
So it's entirely driven by volume of water, not proportion to an area.
It's divided by the area of the load. Yeah. I was worried about questions from you, Mike, because you're the science advisor that's going to tell us how to do this. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot the units. Kilograms per hectare per year. So the number of kilograms of phosphorus coming off of each hectare of land within that hotspot. Okay, so that brings us to our 2022 data, which again looks very, very different from the last 2 years. 2022 was a high flood year. There was a lot of water in southern Manitoba, a lot of water particularly in eastern Manitoba. The Winnipeg River was flooded, roads were closed. We had to actually suspend sampling activities because it wasn't safe to get to many of our sites. And high water levels led to high phosphorus loading. We saw that across southern Manitoba, those phosphorus hotspots in the Seine River showed up again. We also saw some west of the Red River that have shown up in previous years, but we have some work to do to understand why they're there. And then curiously, and this again raises questions about the Winnipeg River, this hotspot just sort of jumps to a new location. And generally that's not what we see when we're measuring an actual hotspot on the landscape. You don't see it light up in one spot and then disappear entirely. So again, a clue that we need to do more to understand that. So ultimately, we see all of this data. We now have 7 years of these hotspot maps as part of an ongoing adaptive cycle of evidence-based policymaking for Lake Winnipeg. Our methods are carefully designed to identify those persistent phosphorus hotspots within the Red River watershed. Governments can then use our data to target their funding, their policy initiatives, their regulation to the hotspots to ensure that they have the greatest impact. And then LWCBMN data can be used over the long term to measure the impact of those interventions, those policies. And we can see over time if our hotspots are becoming less and less pronounced. And over time, we can move our efforts to the other hotspots that are lower down on our map. But ultimately, we see this as an ongoing cycle of adaptive management, policy making, focused on hotspots, measuring reductions, ideally, in phosphorus loading from those hotspots, and adjusting our policy. Throughout this cycle, empirical evidence from the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network guides our efforts, and that is truly evidence-based policymaking. Environment and Climate Change Canada recognizes the value of this targeted approach that we're proposing. In a 2022 evaluation of the last phase of their Lake Winnipeg Basin program, ECCC's Audit and Evaluation Branch recommended targeting limited resources to phosphorus hotspots, and Lake Winnipeg Basin Program Management has agreed to implement this approach by March of 2027. So we're calling on ECCC to leverage LWCBMN data. This is the purpose it was designed for. Use this data to direct their funding where it will have the greatest impact and achieve the objectives of the Lake Winnipeg Basin Program. Yeah.
This is very interesting information and data. Is there a trend analysis of the cumulative phosphorus loading in Lake Winnipeg on a 7-year basis so that we see any kind of change in the phosphorus loading in the lake as a whole, or just a river basis? Do you understand my question?
I think so. So that for that analysis, I would direct you to the State of Lake Winnipeg report, which is put out by the provincial and federal governments and does sort of that cumulative assessment. The province and the federal governments have great data for the larger tributaries, and they show, in their latest report, they don't show trends over time, they average things, and I wish they would do a slightly more in-depth analysis, but you can see how things are varying from year to year. So here's another opportunity for us to make change together. We've put together a policy brief that outlines this data to impact cycle that explains how the CBM program has been designed to answer specific policy questions. We know many people think of community-based monitoring as a fun engagement and education opportunity, and it certainly is that. It's wonderful to see people getting out there and getting hands-on with this type of work. But our program is designed really to generate that robust data that's been missing from our solutions for Lake Winnipeg. We've combined the professional expertise of our science advisors with the remarkable passion and commitment of our volunteers to generate a robust, high-resolution data set that is not possible to collect through any other program. So you can help by sharing our policy brief. You can pick up a copy on our outreach table. You can find it on our website with your member of Parliament, I forgot which level of government we're talking about, and help us spread the word about how to make the greatest impact with this new federal investment for Lake Winnipeg. Okay, we're getting there. That champagne's kicking in, eh? That's why I didn't have any, or this would be a very slurred presentation. Okay, our third advocacy priority is our commitment to respect and uplift Indigenous rights and jurisdiction, and recognize Indigenous knowledge as an important source of evidence for the protection of Lake Winnipeg. This is articulated in our new strategic plan. And in my 12 years of experience working with LWF, I have seen over and over again how Indigenous leaders and knowledge carriers are excluded from Lake Winnipeg decision-making. Indigenous peoples around the lake have important and irreplaceable knowledge that is far too often absent and not available to us as we work towards solutions. And this absence undermines all of our efforts to protect the lake. So as part of our new strategic plan, we recognize the moral and strategic necessity to uplift Indigenous rights and knowledge. The knowledge and experiences of communities who have been stewards of the land for generations is absolutely essential to effective environmental protection. And the Government of Canada has a long-standing legal framework to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples. These rights are enshrined in Section 35 of our Constitution, where they're called Aboriginal rights. Now, it's important to note that Aboriginal rights don't exist because the Government of Canada recognizes them. These rights are inherent to Indigenous peoples. They flow from their long-standing use and relationship to the land, from their language and ceremony and governance systems, all of which existed long before Canada did. But it is important that Canada recognize these rights and necessary that they respect them. In 2021, Canada further strengthened its commitment to recognizing Indigenous rights by passing an act to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The UNDRIP Implementation Act requires that all Canadian legislation be consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it requires the Government of Canada to co-develop action plans with Indigenous peoples to ensure UNDRIP is implemented and its objectives are achieved. Co-development as a process is critical to the success of these action plans. It must be based in meaningful partnership without predetermined outcomes. And by the government's own definition, co-development is a substantive, collaborative, and consensus-based process that develops effective solutions for everyone involved. Unfortunately, so far, the Government of Canada has been struggling to effectively practice co-development. It's not something they're used to. And most of Lake Winnipeg policy continues to exclude Indigenous peoples. These are some of the many governance mechanisms at the Crown government level that develop policy and make decisions for Lake Winnipeg. Many of them have the stated purpose of facilitating collaboration, but they fall short of including Indigenous peoples. In 2010, the federal and provincial governments signed the Canada-Manitoba Memorandum of Understanding respecting Lake Winnipeg and the Lake Winnipeg Basin. We just call it the MOU. And in 2015, 5 years into the MOU, they renewed it again for another 5 years. But Indigenous peoples, despite their knowledge, despite their existing governance systems, despite their long presence around the lake, were not included as signatories in either of these agreements. Then in 2021, just months after the federal government passed the UNDRIP Implementation Act, they signed another MOU. The act was passed in June, the MOU was signed in August, but once again, the MOU did not include Indigenous signatories. So good on paper, trouble putting it into practice. And this pattern repeats itself through other governance mechanisms. Each new policy, each new environmental protection initiative proceeds according to Crown government timelines and priorities, and Indigenous peoples are excluded. State of Lake Winnipeg reporting has never included Indigenous knowledge. And Crown government enforcement of existing environmental laws and regulations is one of the most glaring examples of the exclusion of Indigenous people, and we're seeing the consequences of that now. Let's take the example, because I love to talk about sewage, of the North End sewage treatment plant. I had fun diving into the history, fun in a macabre sort of way, of this sewage treatment plant. What a storied history it is. So back in 2002, I don't even know how to say that year, it was so long ago, 22 years ago, a malfunctioning valve at the North End treatment plant caused a massive sewage spill. Over 3 days, 427 million liters of raw sewage leaked into the Red River. This spill violated the Federal Fisheries Act, which has pollution prevention provisions to prohibit the deposit of deleterious substances into water frequented by fish. The federal government investigated this spill, and they charged the city with a violation under the Fisheries Act. But 9 days into the trial in 2005, the federal government stayed the charges. They stopped the proceedings. They cited insufficient evidence to demonstrate criminal intent. I'm not sure why criminal neglect is necessary for environmental protection regulation, and I need to talk to some lawyers about this. But ultimately, the city faced no consequences under the Federal Fisheries Act, which is one of Canada's oldest and most important environmental protection laws. But the federal government failed to enforce its own legislation to protect Lake Winnipeg. At the provincial level, the sewage spill prompted hearings by the Clean Environment Commission, and ultimately the province issued an operating license for the North End treatment plant under the Manitoba Environment Act. We're all familiar with the deadlines and the timelines on this, but this license was issued in 2005, requiring the plant to be upgraded to meet nitrogen and phosphorus limits. ignoring decades of research that shows that phosphorus is the limiting nutrient and effectively reducing phosphorus succeeds at addressing eutrophication. The initial deadline for the upgrades was 2014, but when the city didn't meet that deadline, the province extended it to 2019. And when the city missed that deadline too, the province has now extended it to 2030. All the while, the treatment plant remains non-compliant, 2 decades and counting since that first environmental license was issued. For its part, the city spent the better part of the last 2 decades dragging its feet on treatment plant upgrades. Mayor Sam Cates, from 2004 to 2014, rejected the provincial nitrogen limit, citing the science that supported a focus on phosphorus, but he failed to take any action on phosphorus. So ultimately, he used that science to just stop action entirely. Even after Cates' departure, construction on treatment plant upgrades didn't start until 2018, 4 years after the first deadline and 1 year before the second deadline. So now I do have to commend councillors and city staff who are taking this file seriously, who have turned this around and are actively working on moving this forward. But Winnipeg still faces a system-wide wastewater infrastructure deficit. And the cycle continues. We come back around to this February's massive spill of raw sewage into the Red River. An enormous pipe running under the river at Abenoji-Mackinac broke and carried 228 million liters of sewage into the Red River over 2 weeks. Ultimately, that sewage flowed downstream to Lake Winnipeg, and we may see the consequences of that spill this summer. It wasn't hard to see this coming. It won't, unfortunately, be shocking if it happens again. Crown governments at all levels have ignored their responsibility to protect Lake Winnipeg for decades. And now First Nations around the lake are taking up that responsibility. This responsibility to protect the waters is a responsibility that was never ceded when First Nations agreed through treaty to share the land with the Government of Canada. So we learned late last month that 8 First Nations from around Lake Winnipeg, from the South and North Basin, from the east and west sides, have jointly filed a legal action against all 3 levels of Crown government for their failures to address the ongoing pollution of Lake Winnipeg. This legal action seeks redress for the impacts of this pollution on First Nation rights and livelihoods, and for the failure of the Crown to accommodate those impacts and other matters affecting Indigenous territories. But above all, the chiefs were very clear that this legal action is about accountability. Accountability to the treaties, accountability to pre-existing environmental protection legislation, and accountability to the water and the lake itself. So at LWF, we recognize this legal action as an important assertion of Indigenous government's responsibility to Lake Winnipeg, and we recognize also that it supports all of us in taking a necessary step to protecting the lake. Today, LWF and our partners at the Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective are pleased to release a new report calling for federal accountability for the long-standing commitments of the government to Lake Winnipeg. This is a report card on a paper we originally released in 2020 called 5 Things the Federal Government Must Do for Lake Winnipeg. And in it, we've highlighted the urgent next steps the federal government must take to protect and restore water quality and ecosystem health, and to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Specifically, the federal government must follow through on its many commitments to meaningful co-development of water policy and programs. The federal government must ensure Indigenous knowledge is included in Lake Winnipeg reporting so that this knowledge is available to guide us towards solutions. And the federal government must provide support to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is shared as part of public policy development processes. So you're the first audience to see this report. It was a lot of work to put together. It's maybe a little bit dense, but I like nerdy stuff like that. But I would encourage you to pick up a copy at our outreach table, take a look through it. You can help us amplify this message by sharing it with your member of parliament. There's a series of next steps outlined in the report. You can pick your favorite one and ask your MP what the progress has been on that action, and ask them to report back to you when progress is made. Ultimately, Our individual voices are small, but together they're part of a resounding chorus of care for Lake Winnipeg. And I know from experience, we cheers to it tonight, that with our tenacity, with our accountability and integrity, we'll look to that next challenge together and we'll tackle it and we'll make change. So thank you all very much for all the work that you do for Lake Winnipeg and for all your support.